So in all of these things we've been talking about is speaking of Jesus, somewhere along the line, people are going to have questions and objections, right? They start saying, yeah, this stuff with Jesus is interesting, but what about? And what about? And I find that most people that love and follow Jesus are terrified to do any of the stuff we've been talking about because they're always anticipating that objection. They're anticipating that somebody's going to say something really philosophical or deep that they don't know how to answer. Well, let me just ask you a really simple question. Do you have objections or questions about life with God? Like, do you have places in your life you're like, gosh, I don't even know how the Bible really works? Or what does it mean that there's all these other religions? Or like, if God is so good and so powerful, then why are there terrible things happening in the world? My hunch is you have a lot of those objections as well. But you still follow God. You still have life with Jesus. So the point is, you don't have to have all of your questions answered in order to follow Jesus, do you? You don't have to know everything perfectly in order to have experience in life with Him. You're evidence of that. I'm evidence of that. If you've heard me teach any amount of time, you've probably heard me say something like, because it's true in my life, there isn't a week that goes by that I'm not an atheist for about 5 to 10 minutes. You know, there's a 5 to 10 minute window where I just go, how could this be? God, how do you allow children to suffer and die like this? How could this be? And I have this moment where I just think, where is God? And actually, if you read parts of the Psalms or even the minor prophets, there's places where they sure look like atheists for different times. Like, God must not be here. God fell asleep at the wheel. In other words, people have questions. They have objections. For you, the real key is that you're not defensive. Defensiveness is simply just a representation of insecurity. That's all it is. When we're defensive, it's because we're insecure. Think about like in your marriage. If you're married, your husband, your wife gets upset with you, says, "Well, why weren't you home for dinner?" Or you said you would take the trash out, or whatever it is. And you shouldn't get mad at that. You just go, "Oh, I don't know. I missed it. I'm really sorry. I want to make that right." But you get mad because you feel insecure. You already know you kind of blew it, and so you feel the need to defend yourself. When you defend yourself in the midst of a conversation around faith, it really demonstrates you're just insecure about your faith. It's totally okay to be like, gosh, I don't really know. I don't have an adequate answer to that. But I would love to find out. This goes back to Philemon 6, where Paul says, I pray that you would be active in sharing your faith so that you would have a full, or sometimes the translation is complete, understanding of every good thing you have in Christ Jesus. You share your faith so that you learn your faith. And when people bring up objections, it's an opportunity for you to grow. And if you're defensive, it's 100% about you. In these resources that you have, we're going to look at 5 objections that people bring up because, frankly, these are the 5 objections that I think exist, and there aren't really that many more. There's little variations of these. It's usually the same 5, which is Jesus really the only way? What about other religions? That would be number 1. Number 2 is, why would I trust the scriptures or the Bible or anything by way of authority? How is the Bible trustworthy? 3, what about evil and suffering? If God's so good, then why is there horrible stuff in the world? Number 4, what about science? I mean, doesn't science disprove things about God? And number 5, what about sex? What about gender, sexual orientation, sex? Why does the Bible seem to be so down on sex, or maybe even just desire? Those 5 objections, and then they have variations within them, of course, as they relate to how people have experienced church or church people, not just God or the scriptures or what scriptures teach. Those 5 things make up the majority of what people object to. Now, even if I ask you all 5 of those right now, my hunch is you might not have great answers for those things. You should have great answers for those things just for yourself, right? I mean, don't you want to have a sense of like how you think about God in relationship to those things? Not just so you can talk to other people about Jesus, but so that you have a deeper faith and a greater trust in the midst of tumultuous moments involving those things. But even if you don't, you still follow Jesus. What's challenging is hearing those objections without being defensive, number one. Learning some ways that those make sense to you, number two. And then number three is really trying to mine for those objections, why people have those objections, because they're usually very personal. When somebody talks about, for example, why is there suffering in the world, they're not usually asking it philosophically. They're not asking about something they saw in the paper. What they're really asking is something like this: why did my mom die of cancer when I was 15? When they ask a question about the Bible, what they're really usually saying is like, how can I trust anybody? How do I trust authority? Authority has been so messed up in my life. How would I trust the authority of the Bible? When people are asking questions about science, they're really saying, I really feel like I have learned a lot in science, or I think rationally. Am I allowed to have a rational mind and follow God? They're usually asking a deeper question that if you aren't defensive and you listen and you press through and you learn with them, you begin to discover that they're asking internal questions, not just philosophical external ones. So anyway, over this week, we've given you some things to read and consider, some things around those 5 objections that you can consider. And then also some challenges to sort of mine some objections from other people without being defensive, without needing to argue them, but hearing things they're thinking about and then investigating if they would go on a learning journey with you. Again, if you're defensive, it's about you. It's not about them. And you want answers for you, hopefully, not just for others.